Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Spinner, and I'll apologize at the top of this for my voice. I got pretty sick last week, and I'm on the mend, but not 100% over it, but we're trying to get our interview done. I'm excited to have a local right here in Farmington author with his first debut novel. I'm going to be talking to Douglas Joslin about his new book, A Sky Full of Color. Douglas, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, my name is Douglas Joslin. I've been working on this book for the last 5 to 6 years, writing decent amounts on and off every year. The characters of which I had come up with a long time ago, but, as a first novel to have out there, I'm really excited.
Well, and I think those first novels are so interesting to hear people's stories because it's so different. The timeline, the inspiration. I think with each successive book, it's a different experience, but I'm always curious to talk with debut authors because that one, it just seems like it's such a big hurdle to get over sometimes, to let people see it, to get feedback on it, all of that. And so we'll dig into some of that. But before I get too far off in the weeds, which I tend to do, tell us a little bit about A Sky Full of Color.
A Sky Full of Color is a book that follows a man by the name of Conlon Aegis, and it's him in his 50s, a good couple decades after his time of service in a civil war that engulfed his country for about a decade. The story follows him providing his recounting of his experience in the war through a interview-type narrative, in which he basically regales the interviewer with his time from when he received his draft notice up into the injury that leads to his discharge of service towards the end of the war.
Well, and I got the impression as I was reading it that war and its effects and just the process is just a topic of interest to you and kind of how this affects people who experience it. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of your inspirations and where you drew your knowledge and examples from as you were writing.
With experience in the topic, I have never served directly, but my brother had served back during the early, I forget the name of it, but the exact wars from the early 2000s up until his time in which he was discharged of service around 2007, 2008. I had also interviewed my former boss at the tutoring center about his time of service, and even though my parents have never served, my grandparents did as well. And so I was always told to appreciate the service that my grandparents, my uncles, went through back during World War II and Korea and Vietnam. And so even though I was never raised in a house that encouraged military service, the aspect of what people have to go through, the things that they see and encounter, and ultimately what they return with afterwards was a huge field of wonder for me. Wonder maybe not the best word, but interest.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating to read different accounts and see how those effects, and especially on the mental and emotional level, how that has changed over time. Because there was really, early on, very little. It was like, well, you're home, get over it. You lived, be happy, move on. And that's really changed over time with the improvements in the understanding of just psychology in general, but PTSD as a diagnosis and just having a better understanding of what trauma does to people. Because it's not a little thing that you can just oh, yay, you survived. You should be fine now. Be grateful, move on with your life. There's a much deeper appreciation and understanding for the effects of trauma, and you dig into some of that with your characters. Was that something that you needed to spend some time researching as well, or was that involved with the interviews and working with family member experiences?
A bit of both. Is the idea of wanting to understand what their headspace was like in the case of my brother and my former boss, having gone through their time of service, but also the delving into the post-traumatic stress disorder and the other psychological effects the characters suffer was also kind of based off of personal experience, not that I've ever served, like I said prior, or have PTSD, but the delving into the psychological and the constant disparity that people can feel. I feel like everyone nowadays still has some idea of loneliness and trying to find an understanding with themselves, their mind, and who they are. And so a lot of the direct psychological effects I was able to pull from with direct experience.
Kind of blending all of that together. Were there fictional sources that inspired you with some of your story as far as your world building and your characters and where you drew from there?
One book that definitely inspired me a lot was a book I was, ironically enough, forced to read in high school. I think it was junior year. It's called The Things They Carried, and it's by one of my favorite authors, Tim O'Brien. And it's a fictional retelling of soldiers going through the Vietnam War, about their time of service, the things that they carried with them in the field, and the things they brought back with them as well. Another big inspiration for that would be All Quiet on the Western Front, a bunch of, in a weird way, hard-hitting movies. As I mentioned prior, my family wasn't a big military household, but they definitely wanted to make sure I understood what people who served had to go through. And so delving into movies and literature in that vein is kind of what inspired a lot of it.
Something kind of depending on the time and which war you're looking at, getting those different ideas and perspectives of what people go through. When you were deciding how to create your world and when to set it as far as technology and what would be available, because today's warfare is very, very different from World War II versus medieval, the closeness, what people are exposed to as far as like what they're seeing, what they're in the middle of, which I think is interesting right now, especially with drone warfare becoming used so much more. There was something I read recently about even the drone pilots still being like, because they're basically using like kind of a VR technology almost to guide them, that even though they're far distant from the weapons that they're actually using with the drones, they're still experiencing some of those outcomes as far as the mental and emotional impact. So I was curious, as it sounds like you kind of are interested in a range of different time frames. What helped you decide like where your story fit and what technology you wanted to use as far as the warfare that your characters would experience?
I forget what book I had read it in, but I remember it was a line that went something akin to machine guns are too impersonal. And that's a weird kind of way of phrasing about it because a gun is a gun. At the end of the day, the purpose of it is to kill the enemy with it. But that line kind of made me realize, in a way, there is a strange, not personal, but like human reaction to when it's set in like, of course, my book is set around the time frame of like 1930s, 1940s technology. And so they would be fighting with bolt action rifles or machine guns, submachine guns, much farther departed from what would later become, the standard of like fully automatic weaponry. And so when it comes to deciding the technology, I was also wanting to think about the aspect of, again, that not personal, but that human reaction to having to methodically take a rifle that is a single shot, aim it at someone, fire, and then you have to reload the bolt. There's more intent into each action of forcing a person to have to commit to such action.
I like that concept of like the intentionality of it, that it's not just something like you're in the middle of and it's happening all around you. Like you really kind of have to choose to participate. You're doing that every single time as opposed to, holding down a trigger or pushing a button. You're far enough away that you're not really seeing the consequences. I would be really interested to talk to soldiers who've operated in different ways and I guess see some of those long-term effects that they've experienced. Because either way, there's still death, there's still destruction that's still going to take a toll on someone. I think that's an important thing to consider if you're writing this type of fiction, of matching up what your characters are going to experience with the style of story that you're trying to tell. Now I kind of want to go do some research, look into some of those effects just for my own personal curiosity. I think an interesting layer to bring in to add realism to a story like this. I'm glad you were able to have different aspects that you had already researched and experienced through fiction and movies that kind of helped guide you on what you wanted as far as your character's experience. And speaking of characters, I was curious about your approach to coming up with and developing your characters. You said earlier that these were characters you'd kind of had in your mind for quite a while. Was this a project that was inspired with a character, or did you have more the idea for the story or some element of the plot first and then brought the characters into it?
So when it comes to the characters themselves, I think it was around either sophomore or junior year, I had just played a video game called Valkyria Chronicles. It's a fantasy World War game where they have somewhat magical equipment and a bunch of cliche tropes, but it was fun. And in that vein, I wanted to create characters I felt could exist in that world. And that was, nearly a decade now thinking about it. And as I was coming out of the pandemic, as we all were, we were trying to figure out what to do. And I found a bunch of old documents I had saved to a flash drive. And I saw these characters, and at the time, all I had come up with was names, like physical appearances and rank. And so when it came to developing them, since this is my first book, my main idea was trying to write a character that I would believe could be a person, if that makes sense. I wanted to make it to where every character, even though some of them have archetypes, they have aspects of them that you could see in every other day people if they were forced into that situation that the characters are put in.
I like that, yeah. I think archetypes especially are a really great starting point. Working with my students, trying to teach them the difference between stereotypes and archetypes, that's always kind of, for ninth graders, that's one where they're like, what? They sound the same. But I like that you recognized kind of where some of your archetypes were and how they would play a role, because I think that's really helpful, especially in developing where your characters are going to grow and develop throughout a story, is what is the role that they play, and then build around from that. And that's something I think, thinking about as far as reading your book, you have several characters that stand out that, as the reader, you kind of get the sense pretty early on of what they're going to do within the story. Not necessarily specific details like, oh, they're going to do this and that and the other, but more along the line of the role that they're going to play and where you show kind of their strengths and some of their weaknesses, and then obviously, where you need to build from there. And that was interesting for me as a reader, and especially since I teach English and writing and all of that as well. Seeing that with my students this year, we did a little bit more of creative writing and trying to work with them on here's a character, and I gave them this big web of all the different things that they should consider about their character. And, most of that doesn't really end up on the page, but when you're thinking about characters and you're developing them and you think about, where does this come from? Where does that come from? A lot of the times they were asking me why do I have to fill out this whole web? Why do I even need to know any of this stuff about my character? But it seems like you experienced kind of working with these characters over multiple years of delving more deeply into them and finding those different motivations and inspirations and where some of those behaviors and ideas came from. Was that something that you did largely as a mental exercise, or are you someone who builds a character Bible where you keep track and you build their story on paper or computer file now? What's your approach as far as how much character building do you do at the beginning, or did a lot of that develop once you started writing and developing the story?
I think a bit of both. One thing I found when writing is people like to be the adventurer or the architect when it comes to creating their stories. The adventurer being someone who kind of just goes where their mind takes them and what they want to write about. The architect being someone who, like you were saying with those character webs, develops every little aspect. I was a bit of both with it. I would develop general beats for each character and for each story, but then as I'm writing it, something would pop into my mind that would make sense for this character, and so I'd try and find a way to work that in. One thing I always found fun was whenever I had read my characters' names, I asked people if they could see that as a real name, something that is a bit distinguishable, but not too generalized. The other one I always had fun with was if I had to pick one of my characters, what was their favorite color, and then why is their favorite color that color? What's the reason behind that? Simple stuff that everyone can relate to with having a favorite color, but then this is a fictional person. They're not real, so why are you creating something like that? It's to help round them out more so as a human that we can imagine and sympathize with.
Because their favorite color may never come up in the story at all.
I don't believe anyone's favorite color does, actually.
But I bet you learned something about that character by thinking about their favorite color and small details like that then informed something else that was included in the story, which is always a fun process, I think, to go through. One of the other things that I wanted to ask you about is, you mentioned earlier this is set technology-wise and warfare style in the 30s, 40s, but your world is not the real world.
No, it's a bunch of fictional countries and people that though they have real world inspirations from, I wanted to make sure that it's more so you can see where the person probably originates from and the background that influenced this fictional country.
With choosing where you wanted to draw inspiration from, there were things that I recognized as I was reading, but I was curious what drew you to specific lore and locations and things like that helped you bring in the different pieces and then meld them into a unique world that has history and its own system of deities and religion, and depending on where the different people are from, they kind of view what's happening differently. How did you bring those bits and pieces together to try to build it into something cohesive?
So I've always been fond of Irish, Scottish, Welsh folklore, the Celtic tribes of ancient history, and the cultural folk tales and beliefs and mythologies that were formed from those individual groups. And so that was a big inspiration. One country, specifically Conlin's country, Doulahan, is just a respelling of Doulahan, the type of people that they are, kind of in the same way of Germany is not spelt as someone who is German. And the word Doulahan in of itself is a Irish folktale creature, a headless horseman-esque fairy that rides around letting the village folk know someone's going to die soon, as morbid as that is. But it was those different mythological creatures and supposed historical figures as well that really inspired the idea of the world I wrote. We have a lot of tales of King Arthur and other European mythologies, but one that I feel is very heavily overshadowed or lost, in part due to it kind of being lost, is those Celtic tales and mythologies.
Yeah, it's kind of an area of the world that, as it was conquered and colonized multiple times, that was really suppressed. And the language and the stories, and we've seen that in our own country, but that was an area that is kind of trying to see some resurgence in both the language and the culture, and try to bring younger people to have an interest in some of those things that have been lost, because you get to the point where a lot of the elders who held those traditions are no longer around. And it's really sad to see things like that start to fade away if that interest isn't renewed. And I think even in things where it's, fiction, it's maybe taking bits and pieces from it, that hopefully, that sparks a little bit more interest from younger generations who are oh, where did this come from? And maybe get them exploring and learning a little bit more about their family's past as well. I think that's cool that you chose that one and that you had an interest in that as well. With that, what aspects of bringing in different elements of culture and belief and history did you find challenging to work with?
Could you elaborate on that?
Did you find any things that as you were trying to bring things together to create your world that maybe didn't work and you had to adjust, or different things like that? Because I know with my writing, I like to explore other cultures and belief systems, and then kind of take bits and pieces and then develop something new. And sometimes I'll get partway through on something and I'll be oh, well, that doesn't actually make sense now that I'm, 2/3 of the way into the story and I've got to go back and fix some things. Did you run into any problems with building your own lore and history for your world?
Most definitely. Now, one thing in particular was when I was getting really deep into building the cultural history of the main continent that the book, or country that the book is set in. I wanted to delve into creating a unique type of pantheon and mythological religion that they follow. And as I was working on all of it, I was this has no way that it can be worked smoothly into the narrative. Some bits and pieces of reference to their cultural history in the narrative kind of just were spontaneous moments, that adventurer type writing I mentioned earlier. And when I tried working on expanding it out in the architect mindset, I kind of realized, does this need to be here? It's a very in-depth system that I was writing, but it doesn't do anything to add to the actual narrative that I was working on.
That's always such a hard balance when you're doing a lot of world building, is how do you bring in the world without stopping the story? And that, I think that's one thing something that we have obviously some really great examples throughout history of writers who did that really well. But it's one thing, I think, especially like as newer writers starting out their careers, it's really exciting to build that world and come up with all the rules and want to explain it and be like, look how many cool things I came up with. But if it, keeps the story from moving forward and the characters aren't progressing, then it's kind of like, oh, well, dang, what did I come up with all that stuff for?
Most definitely. I remember a couple of times where I'd work out a few pages and I'd be so happy that I got them done. And then I'd start going back to looking at my outline I had created and I was like, oh no, those last 2 to 3, maybe even 5 pages I wrote, I can't do anything with. And so I would scrap them and rework them. It's actually kind of funny looking at my original outline for where the story would go and seeing things that I either completely replaced or altered, and I hope at least come across better in the writing than they had originally been planned out.
I thought it was nice how you learn about the world and its history along through the character's journey, rather than getting a big chunk of and here's the history of this town or something like that. As a reader, it's always like, oh, okay, we're going to stop the action and do some learning now, and then we'll go back to the action later. And sometimes that can work, but a lot of times I think in a story, especially one like yours where the pace keeps moving, that it is hard to take several pages away from what's going on and focus on explaining something or going into a detailed history.
That actually reminds me of, it's kind of one of my favorite parts. It's towards the, I'd say maybe quarter, maybe 1/3 way through, in which Conlon and another one of the characters, Theo, are stuck in the woods, and they're starting to discuss, while they're just following along their sergeant, they're just talking about how it reminds them of this certain mythological story, and how when they're in reference to the queen of this old empire, and how the queen ended the Civil War with a simple couple of words. In character, Conlon's like, man, we could really use that right now, all things considered. And it's just those little bits where they're still very much in a situation where the action is progressing and it's not a safe environment for them to be in because it's a war zone, but it's a slight moment of brevity for them to just breathe and kind of continue on, in a weird way, processing where they're at.
Well, and I think it's interesting that, as you mentioned, sometimes you'd write, 4 or 5 pages or something and then realize, oh, I can't really put all of that in here. But I think going through that process of either outlining or doing some sort of mental mapping or however people approach it, but really spending the time to dig into your world, it gives you those moments where you're like, oh, I can bring this little bit and put it into this conversation because you know the world so well. And you've thought about the connections. And so you don't need to go back and explain, 3 pages of this one particular person's role in history. You know it so well that you can bring it into the conversation and have that be just a natural thing that's brought up that they discuss and it has meaning. And even if the reader doesn't need to know the detailed, centuries old history, there's enough context there and they see the connections that the characters make that it still makes sense and you get the point. And you can move forward. But I think that's really hard to do if you don't, have all that extra stuff in your head of having explored your world and built up all of that, whether, either by writing it out or just by spending time thinking about it. Different people, have different processes. But I think as a writer, it's really important to know your world and your characters well beyond the page and really get in and explore it because it lets you communicate those little details to the reader in a much different way.
Most definitely. I remember writing every now and again. I'd take a short break and then I'd get back into the process of writing and I'd have to relearn how these characters think. I'd taken too much time away from it that I'm like, all right, how does character A often react to character B? Okay, then if character B reacts to character A in that way, they would do the following stuff. And just trying to work my way back into the headspace of the characters was always kind of a favorite part to look forward to, but also a challenge because it would lead to maybe me thinking, is this originally how I wrote this character, or am I starting to lose track of where I was planning to go with this character? It's all about trying to find the right, balance with understanding both the character you're writing and the story you're putting the character in.
Yeah. Well, sometimes when you take those little breaks, your mind works out some interesting details or solutions to a problem. And then when you come back and do that refamiliarizing, it's like, oh, yeah, I do need to go back and rework a little part here or make some changes because what's developed in your head maybe wasn't quite the same as what you had on the paper. But I usually find that when I come back to something like that, whatever my brain has worked out in the meantime is usually the right direction to go. So trusting yourself, even if it means going back and fixing some stuff from earlier, very helpful.
I definitely understand that. There were times where I would stop adding anything new to the book and I would just be like, all right, time to see what I've written and make sure that it makes sense. And I hope it does, because I'm like at page 143. I hope I don't have to scrap 43 and go back to 100, But going through that revision after revision just to make sure that it would make sense and what I was saying would make sense to the reader is always a tricky yet fun part.
Well, and Douglas, we are almost at the end of our time, but I did want to ask you before we wrap up, advice that you have for other debut authors who are thinking about or approaching that release of their first book, and what advice you might give to either avoid some issues or prepare, or something that you feel like would be helpful to others approaching this point.
It may sound cliche, but one of the best things I was told was just do it. Do the final step of seeking out any way to get your work published. I kept on delaying myself of, I don't have a literary agent, or I can't do unsolicited submissions to this publication house because they don't take them. And then it was ultimately just, well, I know self-publishing is an option, and that's the way to get my work out there. And as funny as it is, it was my mom who kind of just pushed me finally off that ledge and said, go, do it. You're going to do that now. I was like, okay, and I dragged my feet a little bit. But then once I had the book out there, it was kind of a release of all that like dread in a sense of what will people think, how will people react, and it was more so just the work is out there now. Not necessarily the hardest part is over, but one of the hardest parts is over. And now that you have your work out there, you're able to continue on with other projects you might have, or continue to even look at the project you've put out to the world and see what else you want to do with that.
I think taking that first step, depending on, what a person's journey is, whether that's querying an agent or even just sometimes showing it to someone, is the big barrier. But I think with that very first project, most people have something that is just like that one hard thing to get over. Either fear or whatever it is that's kind of holding them back, confidence. It can be a variety of things, but getting over that first barrier is so crucial in just getting going on whatever path you're going to take and saying, it's not as bad as you probably thought it was going to be, whatever it is.
Yeah, you can always sit on your pile of manuscripts and say that you'll publish them later, but later eventually has to become today.
I like that advice. I think getting out there, whatever it is, whether it's showing your work to someone or actually taking the step to publish, but it's an act of bravery to put yourself out there. And once it is, just opening yourself up to what comes next. And that's a big step in a lot of different arenas in life, but certainly with sharing your writing with people. It can be scary, but it's worth it. And it's a cool process to go through to start hearing what people think and interacting with readers and getting to become part of that writing community. It's a great place to be.
Most definitely.
Well, and just to remind our listeners as we wrap up, the book is called A Sky Full of Color by Douglas Joslin. And Douglas, where can people find you and the book, either here locally or online?
So locally, I've been doing a couple of activities and events around local bookstores. Quill and Quest, they're great people. They're a place that you can also get the book in person. Online, it's available both physical and in ebook format through Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Ingram Sparks directly.
And do you have a website or social media presence that people could follow you on as well?
Not yet. Still working on that part.
In the works, keep an eye out for that. I know it's a whole other side of publishing to deal with the online social media, everything. Keep an eye out for there, and we can always update the show notes with a web address once you have that ready to help people find you a little bit easier.
Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show and for putting up with my froggy voice today as well.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be on here. I greatly appreciate it.